Hi, and welcome to What's Important to You with me, James Dean. On the show, I will be talking to people from all walks of life and asking them the question, what's important to you? Because I believe once we understand what's important, then we can build the life that we truly want to live. I hope you are inspired by the guests that I talk to and answer that question for yourself and build the life that you truly want. You can support the show by clicking on the subscribe button, sharing your favorite episode, or leaving your comments. Thanks for watching. Today's guest is the founder of CYA Consulting and leverages 30 plus years of corporate and entrepreneurial experience for his clients. His corporate career spanned 19 years and included numerous internal investigations on behalf of the Fortune 100 company he served. After he left corporate America, he started several businesses, including his current security consulting, real estate negotiations, coaching, and mentoring. In his current businesses, he uses his investigative background to assist business owners and corporate management teams in researching and obtaining information to move their businesses forward. His unique approach to research, engagement, and investigative techniques serve him well as he draws upon the thousands of interviews he's completed over his corporate and entrepreneur life. Trained in interrogation and interview techniques, he uses his skills and expertise to assist his clients to examine all information available to make the best possible decisions in the present moment. He believes everyone can improve their skills in research, interviews, and better business decisions by preparing and being armed with a structured method to obtain information. This information, along with other observations, allows the business owner or department manager to make better decisions. Today, we find out what's important to Dan Goodwin. Hi, Dan. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, James. Glad to be here.
Yeah, delighted you're here. Really looking forward to this conversation. So, as always, the first question I like to ask, Dan, is what's important to you?
Well, I appreciate you giving me some lead time because I've thought about this. What's important to me is for others to practice personal agency
Mm,
and to make decisions based upon their own research and then live with the consequences and outcomes of those decisions, whether that's good or bad.
yeah, that's an interesting one because it's putting there's a lot in that essentially because the first thing in sense of I like the way you put it in sense of personal agency because it's very specific in sense of the language. I even love that term in sense of agency because a few people would say, "Oh, helping people might be one thing they'll say or something," but it's a very specific when you say personal agency, and then it's also the consequence, and that's the difference as well because a lot of people say, "I just want to help people," but the outcome sometimes is the thing that people can get caught up on because they only want the good outcome. Do you know what I mean? So where does that whole thing for yourself then, in sense of what you say about helping people, to develop that personal agency? Where did that come from?
That came from a lifetime of corporate and entrepreneurial experience. I was always the child that was asking a lot of questions, and that led me into a career, at least at the corporate level, where I was doing internal investigations for a Fortune 50 company that dealt with human issues, fraud and theft, embezzlement, and sexual harassment, and conflict of interest, and all kinds of human issues, right?
Mm,
And the personal agency is to watch people when they made bad decisions, used bad judgment, and then where they ended up, and where they played the blame game, or
mm.
they stood up and took responsibility for what they had done or hadn't done, depending on on which way the pendulum
Yeah,
was moving.
yeah, absolutely. And because it's interesting, because I know when we spoke before briefly, obviously you've had a varied career in a sense of what you've done in the sense of those internal sort of investigations and across very different sort of areas, I suppose. You said just a few of them there. I'm interested to kind of take you back, as it is an interesting area in the sense of, was that the career that you'd set out to do? Because you said you were inquisitive, as a child asking questions. Was that the career you thought you were going to have, or is it something you just kind of found yourself in?
Well, it's funny. I've reflected on that. I've been asked that question
Mm,
before. I don't think one anyone wants to goes in with the idea I want to investigate internal issues in a corporation
no.
to ferret out the bad gals, right? However, um, I think that my personality and my upbringing prepared me for that
Mm,
because I was positive. Go sit down in the corner. You're asking too many questions, son. Right? I was a big challenge, especially to my dad. My mom was a little more tolerant of all the questions. I mean, look, when you're 3 years old or 4 years old, right?
yeah.
It's why
Yep.
you're always answering with a question. Why? And it was it's become clear as I had my own children,
Yeah.
and then watching my grandchildren, putting my children through the tasks, right through the steps, and I get great enjoyment out of that.
Yep. I'm sure. So what was it then in from the sort of the career that you had in the sense of doing that internal investigations? You must have learned a huge when you're because it's obviously you're trying to find something out about a person for whatever reason, but the ability for yourself then to engage and connect with people, whether you're trying to find something out or not, it's trying to find something maybe going wrong, but your ability to be able to engage with people must have been something that you developed over those years. Because what obviously what you do now, but you must have learned how to really connect or engage with people over those years.
Well, that's a true statement. So I've always been an extrovert.
Mm,
Always wanted to be, you know, the life of the party, and always loved to push people's buttons for free entertainment, right? And my ability to get into rapport with people
mm,
quickly what it is a gift. I don't think everybody's built in for that internally. You can train yourself to do that. Even an introvert, I always tell my introverted friends, even introverts need communities, just not maybe as often as extroverts need
yeah.
communities, right? So yeah, when I would go, so when I went to the training class, when I was promoted to an investigator at this company, I was sent to a school in Chicago that primarily law enforcement went to, but corporate people went to it too, to learn investigative skills, a little bit of psychology, a little bit of sales, but a lot of NLP. And I didn't know
Mm,
what neuro linguistic programming was back in the day, but it gave me a framework on how I could interact with people to make them feel seen and heard and validated. It's
mm,
very intimidating, James, when somebody's called into a conference room and introduced to the corporate security investigators.
mm,
That somebody's going to have a bad, right? Somebody's not going to, their day has gone sideways. So my job was to quickly take control of the situation and then reassure them and then let them know that I was there to get their side of the story, whatever that story was,
mm.
whether they were a witness or whether they were the subject of an
Yeah.
investigation.
Interesting. And I'm interested because obviously you've navigated your way from that career of what you're doing to what you're doing now. So what would you say are the were the biggest skills that you took from your previous, if I want to call it career, to what you're doing with people right now?
So when I made the jump from a corporate job many years ago it was with the idea of doing something totally different.
Mm.
I mean, consulting was not even on the radar. I wanted to run away from people who had screwed their lives up, and I was traveling over half the time too. So, I
Yeah.
missed a lot of my own kids stuff, and anniversaries and birthdays. And one time I didn't get home till Christmas morning at 2:30 a.m. because of weather delays, and
Mm.
that's just not fun. So to make the move from corporate over to the consulting clients that I now serve, I was really dragged kicking and screaming back into those skill sets.
Mm.
And the biggest difference I have now is, instead of going back and picking something apart to find what went wrong, I am helping my clients maybe do that in a reactive phase, but in a proactive phase, in a transformational phase, I am helping them discover the answers that they probably know for themselves, and then helping them decide how do they move forward to obtain whatever the stated objective, mission, goal, vision is.
Mm. And what is it that you in the sort of the consultancy world? What is it specifically? Who are the people I suppose that you help specific? Is it to do with business? Is it personal? What's your sort of how do you help people? I suppose.
So that has also evolved over the
Mm.
years. And right now, I'm finding the greatest impact I have is when I talk to C suite teams and business owners to teach them investigative techniques in order to improve their critical thinking and gain clarity
Mm.
as they move forward to their next objective, whatever that objective is.
Yeah.
Sometimes it is, sometimes it is a proactive, or excuse me, a reactive. We need to take care of an issue that's arisen. I like playing in the proactive slash transformation because that's basically looking forward,
Mm.
not backward. So that's how I really find myself. And the investigative skills piece of it teaches everyone to have a common language, so there's no ambiguity about, well, I thought James meant this when he said that.
Mm.
And that gives you a common foundation to have really frank, sometimes intense conversations, but at least everyone knows where they stand and what's expected and what's the desired outcome.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting because it's a obviously I'm sure because one from your own experience of being in that corporate space, but then when you're in the room in the sense of that C-suite, and I think you used the word there, it could be intense. That's it is because the decisions that are being made in those rooms have a huge impact on one, obviously, either a company or the people within it. So they are big decisions to be made. So how do and I'm sure then they're full of big personalities as well. Do you know what I mean? It's hard probably to get to that level without sort of having to do something. So how do you find as well then to be able, because you say that thing of like who said this or understanding, if you're there as the consultant, how do you find is there a part of what you have to do is almost to try and manage the various different personalities in the room, whether it be people with egos or not? Is that something that you have to be able to do when you're doing your job?
Absolutely. So managing egos is one of the greatest challenge, and it's just not, people think, well, that guy's so egocentric. It's not just um it's just not a male or female thing, because I've
Mm.
seen females with big egos generally called a bad word, right? Well, she's just being you fill in the
Yeah.
blank, right? I'm not
Yeah.
sure if where if your audience is PG or not. So,
Yeah.
but 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 it is having the uh, most emotional intelligence, the
Yes.
EQ, to read the room. You have to know your audience. Um, I've got a mentor that says, as far as being intense, he says, I say what I mean, but I don't have to be mean while I say it. And a lot of people struggle with that
Yes.
because they let their emotions run them down because they start taking it personally. And that's the exact moment you need to take a step back, count backwards from 5 or 10 or whatever, and then find out, because when people come at you highly emotional about something, their ego's involved, or it says more about a past event or a past trauma in their life. It's what has, to use the word the cool kids use, what triggered them, right? What triggered that response? And that's what I always look for is I seek to understand why somebody would come, or maybe, and the other side of it, they actually are a narcissist or a psychopath. it could
Yes, it's
it could
true as
be it
well.
could be their so anyway, lots of psychopaths do very well in business,
Yeah.
as long as they can ramrod the show or manipulate the show.
Yeah, absolutely. And is that when you again, because I suppose when you're working with those groups, I'm really interested because I've not had many people that I've spoken to are working with that sort of level. Are they bringing in for, because a lot of times, if I'm working with an individual, the reason that you're brought in, say they say, well, actually, Dan, we need you to fix this or this decision within our company, whatever it is. If I wonder if it's similar to individuals, well, actually, the real sort of thing that's to be solved is actually probably a few layers deeper. The sort of, so if someone comes to me, they say, oh, it's because of like a lack of confidence, for example, or something, or I just want to feel this a different way. When you go down a couple of layers into it, it's actually a completely different. That was just the surface level reason they've come to you. Is it the same at that level in those groups, that actually when you start to do your sort of work with them, it goes a lot deeper than what they're asking you to do? The initial goal is only real surface, and there's a lot more to be done once you get into the detail.
Well, absolutely, because people have mainly two reasons for an answer, and the first reason is what sounds good publicly,
Mm,
and then the second reason is the real motivation for them. Hopefully those two are congruent, right? And they're this one and the same. A lot of times they aren't. That's why I mean, pick, oh my God, the last 3.5, 4 years, pick any subject you want to insert subject here, and then figure out, what was said publicly versus really what we know to be facts privately. And that
mm,
goes in and that goes on in corporations every day. And some of that is damage control, some of that is PR, right? Part of that is it's all to put on your best face or save face, right? To save the embarrassment. A lot of investigations I did never made the headlines. Obviously, who wants bad PR for their company that they lost X million of dollars in an embezzlement scheme or a fraud scheme, or employees were using devices for child porn, or people were running second businesses off of their company computer? Who Nobody wants that publicity.
yeah.
But the fact of the matter is, when you're dealing with humans, you're going to get some of those issues.
Absolutely. And how did you then, over the years, when you're dealing with such serious subjects and very in sort of, whether I'm sure the wrong side of legal for sure, how did you manage to cope with that yourself as a human? Because it's it seems to be, I'm not sure, in a sense of the intensity of doing this day after day for the number of years you do. How did you manage yourself in those years?
Wow. I would say developed calluses, and
Yeah.
that is not a good thing. I remember the first investigation I ever did. I went to a location and interviewed a young single mom of three who had committed some what you and I would consider a minor fraud. Uh, and it was taking revenue from the company. And she admitted it. And I remember going back to my hotel that night and just just in tears because there was a zero tolerance. And
Mm.
I remember sitting with that the supervisor for that particular location, and she broke down in tears when I showed her the statement from the lady I'd interviewed, and she said if she'd have just asked me for the money, I'd have given it to her.
Mm.
So because that was more, it was a smaller town and more like a family, you know.
Mm.
And it was, I'll let this much. It was a military. A lot of the spouses from military were
Yeah.
employed in this location because it was the thing to do while while the spouses were off, deployed. And very upsetting for me
Yeah.
emotionally. It was a real eye opener, and realizing how blessed I had been in the
Mm.
family and the circumstance. I was, very middle America. We didn't have huge amounts of money, but I felt good about it. So the way I got over that is, I talked to my supervisor and my boss, and I said, just I came out of here knowing I did a good job. I did what I came to do because it was my first solo journey.
Mm.
At the same time, I felt crap, right? I just
Mm.
felt, and finally came to the conclusion that I did not make the decision for her to do what she did.
Mm.
And that has served me well. That was my first investigation. So hundreds of investigations later and consulting clients after I left, I did not I did not make that decision on their behalf. They practiced personal agency,
Mm.
whether they had an understanding of that or not. They practiced personal agency, which put them into that slot,
Mm.
that position.
Yeah, absolutely. Because yeah, because as you say, because one is could be. I was thinking more in the sense of obviously the type of maybe investigations you're looking at and the sort of seriousness of them. But as you say, and as you said a few times, it's coming down to dealing with humans and reflected as your own humanity in those situations. So it's how you're able to reconcile it yourself and but it's the reason I asked the question because I think it's an important thing for people to hear is as you say is you had your responsibilities with the job that you're doing and the people that you're investigating had made those personal decisions, so it's otherwise I'm sure if you didn't find that strategy it could have just consumed you in for all the investigations you have been through over those years.
Absolutely. And we did have people that came into the investigations group and exited.
Mm.
They couldn't handle it. And a large part of our investigative staff were ex law enforcement.
Mm.
So to move from law enforcement, retire from law enforcement at a local, state, federal level, and come in, they had already cut their chops basically on how they dealt with this. I think coming in as a quote unquote civilian to that sort of lifestyle of investigations is it's difficult, it's challenging, maybe not difficult, but it's challenging for how you treat mindset and still maintain humanity and caring
Mm.
for people.
Mm.
Right, you were right. You said I was proud of the job I did because that's what I was getting paid to do. And if people were stealing, if they were embezzling, um, I didn't feel bad for those people
Mm.
because they made a deliberate choice on what they did. The ones I felt bad for were the ones that hadn't processed their own personal agency and they were influenced or coerced by
Mm.
others, which then put them in a bad position because they didn't feel like they had control.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, this is a question that's just coming to my head as you're talking about it. Did you actually enjoy the process of the investigation?
I enjoyed the adrenaline of the hunt, right?
Ooh,
I enjoyed oh, 90% of the work I ever did on an investigation was done before I ever left my desk in the cube farm where I was stationed. So I was here in Kansas City at the height of all the M&As back in the late 90s, early 2000s. We had 88,000 employees in the system, and we had 28 investigators or in the investigative arm. So we were busy all the time.
yeah.
So, Monday morning, 8:30 Central, all 28 people would be on a conference call. We'd go around the room and say, James, what are you working on this week? Dan, what are you working on this week? Paul, what are you working on this week? And then the director would say, okay, Dan, you need to put that one on hold, and I need you in Dallas, Texas this afternoon. So go. So I always had a go bag ready, right? Because we all had different specialties or skill
Yeah.
sets. We were just assigned where we had the highest chance of success.
Mm,
So that whole thing, the adrenaline of actually doing the research, doing the work, finding out you had the evidence that absolutely locks the case up. So that the
mm,
remaining 10% is we already know what happened. We probably already knew how it happened. We're there to find out the why.
yes.
We're there to find out what motivated this event to happen. And that's where you interact with people to ask, James, tell me your mindset. What were you thinking about this? Why is that important to you? And
Mm,
we drill down. We drill down the questions until we get to the bottom.
yeah. No, it's interesting in the sense of the phrase you use there, in the sense of the adrenaline of obviously the hunt of the investigation, because it's interesting because the reason I sort of asked that question, it's like I think I mentioned it when we chatted previously, sort of my wife's career. I won't go too much into it, but she's always been into sort of that side of whatever she's done in sense of her work. And the difference between one of the differences between myself and herself is she would think a lot more sort of laterally in some ways than I would. And and it very much it sounds like yourself. She's like, she won't let it go if she knows there's another thing to find, and she's trying to find the next thing and the next thing, and she keep going into it. Whereas I would more likely probably take someone at face value and go, okay, fine. You know what I mean? I wouldn't necessarily have that um suspicion in a sense of I'd be so much more sort of accepting, I suppose, in some ways. Maybe that's maybe a good thing in some ways, but not for that type of role. Do you know what I mean? I'd be like, oh, Grace, and he, gave me a perfectly good reason. So I do find it interesting when I chat to people like yourself who kind of go, oh no, there's another thing here, there's another thing, and but you're getting the kick out of doing it. I find it really interesting.
Well, yeah. I mean, so one of the things we learned in investigation school is to lean in to the silent spaces, right? To lean
Mm,
into what's being said. The advantage that we have is when we share space with people, it's here's the numbers are 55 is nonverbal, 38 is tone, and the rest of it's the words.
yes.
And so when it's kind of like being a great poker player, right? Do you
Yeah.
have a tell? So the way, how do you combat that, or how do you overcome that? So I have had people. How can you tell? How can you tell when people are lying? Do they look up and to the left? Do they, do they flush? Does their neck get red? Well, it's yes, and that may be what's on TV, but there's more to it than that. So if you really want to get into a conversation with people and find out if they're scamming you or if they're not telling you the whole story and you're in the same space, this is where it's easier. You can ask what I call baseline questions. So baseline questions are automatic response questions, autonomic I don't have to think about these. What's your name? What's your title? What's your service date? Who's your supervisor? What's your home address? And so, obviously, I have this information from their HR face sheet, right? It's in front of me. And
Mm.
I've even had people say, why are you asking me these questions? They're right in front of you. You got, yeah, but sometimes HR screws up and the system's wrong, whatever the answer is. So you go through these, and there was 14 of them, 14 questions. So, and the reason you do that as an investigator is you're looking for those automatic responses. So then when I start to ask the harder questions, the ones that are going to lead down a path of uncomfortable answers, probably, is to see what changes physiologically
Yeah.
and psychologically. And because I will be able to tell, is this something that they're withholding information? Do I press this? Do I use silence? Silence is a huge weapon.
Mm.
I shouldn't use the word weapon. It's a
Yeah.
huge strategy.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
we
Yeah.
need it. It's a strategy though. And so it's like I ask you a question, James, and you see me, because I'm going to describe this since people, they're going to be listening to this.
Yeah.
So I looked down at my notes. I write something down. I look up to you, and I hold your gaze for a half second. I hold my pen up, well, just saying, wait a minute. And then I write something down the second time. Now, if you're on the other end of that exchange, you're saying, well, that was weird. I
Yeah.
wonder what he wrote down the second. So that piece of it, you ask hypothetical questions. You can ask questions for something that never happened, and those
Mm.
are they're just test questions.
Yes.
Because if I say, James, now you said you were at this place at this time. Did you happen to notice that that car wreck out, at that intersection at that time and date? I heard it was a doozy. So a truthful person that there was no car wreck, right? They're going to say, I have no idea what you're talking about. I do not remember a wreck. A deceptive person who wants to get in the good graces, air quotes there for the audience, get in the
Yeah.
good graces, are going to struggle to appear cooperative.
Yeah.
They're going, oh yeah, that was terrible. So 5 minutes later, I come back and say, oh, James, you know what? I screwed up. I I think I got the wrong date. That wreck was, I think that was the night before. So now what have I done? I've I've literally kicked a brick out from one of their answers.
Yeah.
And see, I'll let people lie to me all day long, and then I'll go back and we'll revisit it. And I only have to do that once or twice for people to get the idea that, oh, I need to be really careful about
Yes.
how I answer these questions. Because if it comes to a material point that is important to the investigation, I encourage people, just shoot straight with me the first time. If this went wrong, just tell me, because I don't want to have to write down that we had to revisit the same question 3 times before you got your memory back.
Yeah. Very interesting. And then I'm sure that's just like a very tip of the sort of iceberg as such of techniques and things that you've used over the years. But very interesting. I was even, as soon as you say that, the one you said about like the holding up the pen and then looking back to take the second note, that time I could almost just feel myself leaning out of my chair, sort of wanting to, I'd want to look over and see what the second note was. So you could immediately get the sense of how uncomfortable it would make someone feel. So I'm interested now in a sense of, because obviously you had that sort of sort of investigation careers for a long time, and you said you switched over consultancy. What was the sort of moment you thought, well, actually, you know what, I'm gonna switch out of here now. I'm decided to leave the corporate and more go into sort of yourself, their more entrepreneurial way of life? Was there a big decision, or was it something you just naturally came to?
I was drug kicking and screaming back into investigations. When I
Oh,
left corporate, it was the idea to go into real estate investing. And that was about the time that the market started crashing and burning back in 2007, 2008. And I found myself negotiating what in the US we call short sales. Across the pond, I think you call it negative equity,
yeah.
on behalf of people that were facing foreclosure. And I found myself using my contacts and using my skill sets to do negotiations. And at all that same time, I had friends and family that had small and medium enterprises, and they had all those issues that we discussed and listed out earlier. And that's really where I thought, you know what? These people, these small and medium enterprises don't have an investigator on
Mm,
staff. They don't have an HR person to help them. They don't have an employment attorney on speed dial. And I found myself on the reactive side creating a construct for them to follow. That later led into, helping them when they got ready to scale up. That later that led on to then the training for the
mm,
business owners in the C suites. And that's led ultimately to being able to keynote speak to work associations and teaching some basic skills on how to use investigative techniques and questions to build critical thinking skills.
mm. Yeah, that's an interesting one because when you bringing it to that point there, because you mentioned earlier that when you say about critical thinking skills, because obviously at the level that you're aiming at, what do you mean when you say about critical thinking skills? Tell me a little bit more what you mean by that.
Sure. I'll give you an example.
Mm,
People ask questions primarily two reasons. And the first one is to affirm their current belief, whatever situation. Like people, your listeners can't see this, but James, this shirt makes me look awesome, right? So what am I doing there? I'm seeking affirmation. I'm seeking a compliment. And then the other reason people ask questions is they're seeking new data points.
mm,
And then, so conversely, so that's the two main reasons. Conversely, people don't ask questions because they don't want new data points, because then they have to process information, and then they have to make a choice to either take action or inaction. And agnostically, there are consequences, whichever path you choose, good or bad, to take action or to ignore. There can be good or bad that comes out of either one of those.
mm,
And the simple fact is this: if people discover something new that is life changing for them, they may go back and share that with their community, whether that's friends, family, work, you
mm.
know, church, social clubs, whatever. And that piece of data, that their newfound knowledge, may or not may or may not be accepted by who
Yeah.
they're wanting to share their revelation with, right? And so instead of processing data points and coming to your own conclusions, you abdicate your critical thinking to whatever is around you.
Mm,
And that's the reason.
yeah. And so when you're, how do you then, I suppose, with what you're working with the people you're working with, what's then the key element to then for people to really take ownership of their own sort of one their critical thinking, and then whether to take the action. So how is it, because it's one thing working with people, getting them to understand what they need to the thinking to get it into a way, but I've always find the final piece of actually people taking the action on what they've worked on is the hardest bit for a lot of people. How do you help your people then to actually, what, you're going to have to implement some of this stuff? What's your sort of technique in relation to that?
The first the first is that you give them permission to fail.
Mm.
A lot of people are held up because they don't want to be seen as a failure. So that is important, just to give them permission to fail. Now, when I first started the consulting piece of it, I found myself telling people what to do.
Mm.
That was that was the young Dan. That
Yeah.
was many years ago, right? Because I can quickly identify where the stumbling blocks are and say, okay, you need to do X, Y, and Z, right? You need to, this is, and here's the 1, 2, 3 steps that you need to do to get it out there. Um, that worked for people that were good at taking orders, that are good at
Mm.
systems process oriented people. So over the years, I've modified my approach and I've asked people, let me preface this.
Mm.
Most people know what they need to do
Mm.
before they ever come. They instinctually, in their gut, they know what they need to do. They've got to have permission to fail, but they also have permission. They also have to have permission to proceed
Yeah.
because of constrictions that mainly is in their own head
Mm.
that they've perceived. So now we'll go over strategies and tactics, and then we'll go back and say, okay, of all of these things we've talked about to help you move forward, what are you willing to do? Where are you willing to spend your time, energy, money, resources? What are you willing to do? So what this does is forces people to make a commitment to what they're going to do. And then the fun part comes for me is then I get to hold them accountable to what they said they were already going to do instead of me
Yeah.
telling them what to do. It's a
Yes.
total different, it's a game changer.
Yeah.
And I remind them of that. Now, this is what you committed to do. So what's changed? Because sometimes there are changes. I mean, you still have
Yeah.
to be flexible, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes there are changes. But I look at that and say it with a smile on my face, and they know the only one they're letting down is themselves because
Mm.
they won't take that next step that they said they were going to do.
Yeah. Absolutely. And even I think even the example you're saying there in the sense of that, absolutely that whole thing of one, the permission to proceed, the permission to do it, and then there's the permission to fail. It's that acknowledgement because even you'd say the story you said like this there, the example, maybe the previous iteration would have been of Dan would have been telling them what to do versus now sort of really putting it on the onus on the person. It's not to say that previous telling them was a failure, but it wasn't necessarily the best strategy. For the people you're trying to help. So even like it's okay to keep changing what you do, to change the process, even when you think something is working, for example, that it can still be amended, still be changed. And that whole thing of allowing yourself to get things wrong is the biggest permission because it's one of those things that I've learned is like the outcome we have no control over, whether it's a win or loss or a fail or whatever it is. It's the willingness to give it a go that's the hardest bit or the most important bit the same. Would you say like because obviously going into that as a business, you're setting up going into the entrepreneurial side of it. How did you find that from going from being in a corporate world to then being I'm now Dan, the entrepreneur. What was that sort of uh, transition like?
Yeah, I made a lot of mistakes
Yeah.
and realized that the support I had in a corporate environment, I had to create that support in an entrepreneurial environment, a business ownership environment. I should have stayed another probably year in the corporate job. I thought I was ready. I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready. And so when I have people that are thinking about, jumping the ship from corporate to entrepreneur, I have a very frank conversation with them. Say, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? The other piece of it that I was unprepared for was to really market my skill set
Mm.
and my skills, because I always saw myself, my skill set, as a secret agent versus, being out there doing things. I mean, it was 5% James Bond and 95% paperwork, but we did have access to some really cool research tools. And when I left, the two computer forensics guys, employees, reported directly to me. So we had some, and this is back in 06, 07. I mean,
Mm.
technology's come a long way since then.
Yeah.
Pretty cool tools back then, for our work, for what we did and how we did our research. I didn't have that available after I left, obviously.
Yeah.
But, but the challenge for me was to figure out how to market the package. And a
Mm.
lot of my business came from word of mouth. So I really wasn't forced to go out
Yeah.
and really put it on the market and say, hey, if you're getting screwed over by your employees and they've stolen $2 million from you, call me. I can help. That's where do you advertise that?
Yeah.
Where does
Yeah.
CAD go, right? Or where
Yeah.
does that, does that Google listing go?
Yes.
So yeah, so I would have done things differently, much
y-
differently,
For
if I had to
sure.
do.
Yeah, for sure. But I think again, it's like anything, it's recognizing that and then being able to kind of the same way you think you'd maybe do it differently, but it's also recognizing the learnings from those experiences as well. One of the things you mentioned there as well earlier was one of the things you're trying to do now is we said from our previous conversation is you're looking into sort of the speaking sort of side of stuff now as well and being a keynote speaker. What is it that's attracting you to the sort of world of speaking?
Well, the thing that attracts me is to get the message out quicker,
Mm.
to go from the one-to-one client serving, to the one-to-many, and attract those that need my skill set at a higher level, at a well, almost more of a training level,
Mm.
to help them navigate the crazy times we live in. What is real, what is information and misinformation. um, who is real is the more important question when you
Mm.
deal with how do you encourage people to be authentic, and not their social media persona, not their
Mm.
character that they're acting, but to really dive deep. And I've been called a lot of things. I've been called intense, intimidating, and I just think it's real. It's funny, and I think I shared this with you in our previous conversation, but right underneath my camera, I have a label that says smile, because to remind me to smile once in a while, because I I look through people's eyes into their soul and can really quickly gauge, if they're being real, authentic, if they're just in a world of hurt, and
Yes.
that gives me clues on then how can I connect with this person and then make them feel safe to share information with me. And I
Yeah.
didn't think that was possible on Zoom
Mm.
until 2020 happened. And I found out that it's not the same as you and me being in the same space, but I've learned to actually accentuate the skill sets I have. And I've got some great compadres that can do some, face reading, and also all we trade stories all the time.
Yeah. No, I think it is because it's interesting because this the whole thing as you say there is like the obviously I can understand why you want to be able to try and reach more people because it's and is it now in a sense of when you're talking about the training from this perspective of understanding people from your experiences, if you were to sort of the one to many, is it to be able to enable them to still assist in sense of with their work, or is it to even some people to help self-reflect? There's because there's an element of like you're helping other people discover or investigate, but a lot of the techniques you're talking about probably will help an individual in a sense of understand themselves a bit more as well. Does that make sense?
Yes, the professional development piece when done correctly, should always support the personal development piece.
Yeah.
That's my opinion. I've seen it work so many times. Um, it's funny. One of the first things they taught us when I went to investigative school was the techniques we're about to share with you work on everybody but your spouse. And I thought it was a great disclaimer because your spouse really knows who you are, the real you, right?
Yeah.
And you know the real them. And so when we put on our business, our game face, when we go out into the world, that, that's that's part of it. The challenge is to get deep into the parts that we need to complete our job. At the same time, those techniques can be internalized and then shared with your family, your spouse, or your kids, or whatever, and actually help you be a better person, to listen more attentively,
Mm.
to pick up on the changes in language. My kids, as you can probably imagine, my kids, you'll have to ask them. I don't think they enjoyed their teenage years quite as much as some of their friends were enjoying them.
Yeah.
Say it that way.
Yeah. So then it's like we wouldn't be able to get away with anything. Like, don't you be able to spot a lie a mile off?
Well, one of my kids couldn't lie if they wanted to. The other one was always working the angle, always working the angle. And I will not tell you which parent they took after for that.
Yes.
But you may be looking at that parent. I don't know for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
Thank
Oh, I love it. I love it. Um, Dan, one of the questions I always like to ask the people I chat to is something I have an interest in. Is I do like, I think, quotes and phrases. I think they can actually be quite powerful or quite impactful. Are there any quotes or phrases that are important to you?
Oh, so a couple come to mind. Um, and I don't know who said this. The last person I remember hearing say this, the one I give credit is Brian Tracy. Everything counts. Every small decision. Everything counts.
Mm.
So when you do a great retrace, um, you've got to figure out, why are we here today, James? Right? Who
Mm.
introduced? Well, I think it was Joseph, right?
That's right. Yeah.
His founders. So how did I meet Joseph? Well, I met him through Lee Tony Ware. And where did I meet Lee? Well, I met him through a gentleman in California that was doing a mastermind. Now, where did I meet that gentleman? Oh, that was in the C-Suite network. How did I get connected to the C-Suite network? Well, it was a lady named Teresa Rose. How did I connected to Teresa? Cold cold in mail on LinkedIn, right? So if I hadn't signed up for LinkedIn 16 years ago, none of
Yeah.
this would be happening, right?
Yeah.
So that's the first one. Everything counts. The second one is how I sign off on a lot of my communications, is practice grace, mercy, and love whenever possible.
Mm.
People say, why did you put whenever possible? It's because sometimes people won't allow you to practice grace, mercy, and love. If they are evil and they intend you harm, you can practice grace, mercy, and love on them maybe as a individual human, but you need lawyers, guns, and money when you're fighting them,
Yeah.
because there is that opposite force. There is that balance that is sought within the universe, good versus
Mm.
evil, and you must protect yourself and your loved ones. So practice grace. So that's the two. That's the two I have
Yeah.
for you.
I love that. No, I love them, and it's yeah. No, I find it fascinating because what I love about it as well is when I hear people say them is so often, which is the same as yourself, is they're reflected on what people do. You know what I mean? And as you say, like the fact the first one is well, everything counts. That very much comes across in a sense of like what you've done throughout your career as an investigator. That sort of finding every single part of it to build up the case, or as you gone into the consulting. So no, I really pretty appreciate you sharing them. Really interesting. The next part of that sort of question is, who would you say have been the biggest influences in your life, Dan?
Well, I've got one public and one private.
Mm.
Um, the public one for personal and professional development. I mean, if people know who John Maxwell is, that shouldn't be a surprise. I got to spend some time with John when I was a very young man. I was a gopher gaffer for my uncle who had a productions company. So we would go into sales rallies and fly the speakers and get the cameras ready and end up so by the time I was 16, I was backstage with all these keynote speakers. So Pat Riley and Florence Littauer, John Maxwell, Oliver North, and I got to spend time in the green room with these people before they went on stage. And Les Brown was just fantastic. But John Maxwell, with his books, he codified systems for
Mm.
leadership. And I've got every single Maxwell book, with maybe exception of the latest one, and it really impacted how I organized my life and my thoughts. And even while I was still working in corporate, it made an impact on how I approached my job and my
Mm.
responsibilities. So that would be the first one. The second
Yeah.
one is my music teacher from seventh grade, and her name was Texana Olenberger. And she fundamentally changed the course of my life. When I was 12, 13, going into junior high, well, there's no probably. I was just picking the wrong friends. Okay, I'll just say it that way.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was hanging out. I was hanging out with the wrong people. Um, her ability to get me involved in music and performing arts fundamentally changed the course of really where I ended up. And I give her, publicly and privately, give her kudos for taking an ornery, troublemaking, you know,
Yeah.
instigator of fun. I'll say it that way, instigator of
Yeah.
fun, and really helped me focus, and got me involved in musical and performing arts
Yeah.
versus going down the path of where I was headed. So those are my two.
Yeah, I love that. That's fabulous. Um, and I think it is. I think it's amazing in the sense of those people who can have influence. And I think I really appreciate you sharing those two stories because the thing is, I find sometimes with the win the world now. You said it earlier in the sense of the word of using the modern phrase of trigger. It's the other one that we have at the moment is the whole thing of influencer, and I think this is not to be confused with people who can influence. It's you can take influence and inspiration from anyone, in a positive way, but I think with the term modern day term of influencer it has a bit more malevolence to me, and it's almost just trying to circumvent and just trying to bring you in, versus like you say that teacher that is amazing. You were 12, 13, and they still had that impact on you, and that sort of the sort of sliding doors moments. I think that can be really powerful. So I think sometimes we can look for those influence a lot closer to home, but then as well, in the same sense, the ones who are maybe more public, we can still take them on board as well. You're the second person as well to talk about John Maxwell in here as well. That the other chap was Jan Roberts. Was chatting to him before, and it's the same. Huge influence from John. So I only know him a bit of him, so I'm going to be looking more into John's work, and for sure. Um, Dan, it's been an absolute pleasure to chat to you. I do have one more question for you before I let you go, though, and that's what's important for your future?
One word: legacy. This is
Nice,
where I'm working.
nice.
This is what I'm working on for this chapter of my life. I've got the education, survived my teenage years, and then um, was a little rambunctious early in my corporate career. Kind of settled down with that, learned my skill set, learned my trade. Made that chapter transition to entrepreneurship using my innate skills and my training. And now it's time for me to pass on those learnings to the next
Mm.
generation, to show them that they have permission to think for themselves and to draw their own conclusions and to learn from others and to be open other ideas and process those ideas. So it comes back to that is my legacy. That is what I want to leave to my kids and my grandkids.
Love it. Absolutely fabulous. As I say, Dan, it's been an absolute pleasure to chat to you. Obviously, I want to make sure people continue to find you and support you. So we'll make sure there'll be links in the show notes. But if you want to give a shout out now where people can connect with you online, go for it.
Yeah, best place is LinkedIn. That just look for Dan Goodwin, CYA Consulting, and CYA stands for Cover Your Assets, in case you heard it differently in your neck of the world, right? So, yeah, I'm not a secret agent anymore. You can find me on LinkedIn.
I love it. Love it. Thanks so much. Yeah, the link will be there so you can connect with Dan on LinkedIn. Once again, Dan, thank you so much for chatting to me today.
Thanks so much. I've really enjoyed it, James. Have a great day.
Thanks. Thank you for watching or listening to this episode. I really hope you enjoyed the conversation. To support the show, please subscribe on your favorite platform, share your favorite episode, get involved with your comments, and give the show a rating. If you want to learn more about what I do, you can follow me at James Dean Coaching on Facebook and Instagram, connect with me on LinkedIn, or check out my website, jamesdeancoaching.com.